So thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. My name's Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on the social medias, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Tonight, we're very thrilled to welcome Kelly Weill in conversation with Robert Evans. Since 2015, there has been a spectacular boom in a nearly 200-year-old delusion, the idea that we all live on a flat plane under a solid dome ringed by an impossible wall of ice. It is the ultimate in conspiracy theories, a wholesale rejection of everything we know to be true about the world in which we live. Where does this idea come from? Kelly Weill draws a straight line from today's conspiratorial moment back to the early days of flat earth theory in the 1830s, showing the human impulses behind divergences in belief. Faced with a complicated world out of our individual control, we naturally seek patterns to explain the inexplicable. The only difference between then and now, social media. Empowered by Facebook and YouTube algorithms, the flat earth movement is growing. At once a definitive history of the movement and a readable look at its expansive, absurd, and dangerous present, Weill's Off the Edge, Flat Earthers, Conspiracy Culture, and Why People Will Believe Anything, introduces us to a cast of larger-than-life characters, from 19th century grifters to the provocateurs of our current internet times. We accompany Weill to Flat Earth conferences where we meet moms on vacation, determined creationists, scammy YouTube celebrities and their victims, neo-Nazi rappers, and much more. Incisive and clear-eyed, Off the Edge tells a powerful story of how we arrived at this moment of polarized realities, and it explains what needs to happen so that we might all return to the same spinning globe. Weill will be joined in conversation by Robert Evans. He's an investigative journalist, host of the podcast Behind the Bastards and It Could Happen Here. He's also the author of A Brief History of Vice, and his forthcoming novel, After the Revolution, is coming out soon from AK Press. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question at any time. And if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, you can even upvote that particular question. Most importantly, please support Kelly and Powell's by purchasing copies of Off the Edge from us. Links to buy that, as well as links to buy Robert's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Kelly, Robert, we're so happy to welcome you both tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Kelly, I gotta, before we get into more of the meat of this, I'm really curious, as someone who writes books too, was Off the Edge the working title from the beginning, or did you kind of iterate that?
It was pretty much the working title from the get-go. It was one of those things where like you have a slogan and it almost guides the book. We tinkered with the subtitle a little bit, but no, it was pretty much there from its incarnation when I was still doing the research. It's like, oh, it almost felt like it could be the only one for me.
Yeah, it's definitely the way I think about conspiracism a lot, because everyone believes in some kind of conspiracies a little bit. You talk about this in a book a little bit, these little things that like, well, I guess I can't prove this, but I do believe it. And maybe you could call me a conspiracy theorist for that. Everybody's got, a little bit like that. And then some people find it's almost like there's a key that gets, turned in their head and they go off the edge. And it's interesting to me the way that buying into one of these things can kind of lead folks down this rabbit hole, because the flat earth is definitely more on the fringe of conspiracy culture, especially if you compare it to like anti-vax sentiment, which is probably the most mainstream conspiracy theory today, although you've also got like the election conspiracy theories and stuff. I'm wondering, in the time, because you've been on this particular beat for quite a while, in the time you've been covering it, how have you seen the on-ramps to belief in flat eartherism kind of alter or evolve, might be a better word?
Yeah, I think conspiracy movements online have evolved from being a bit more siloed. Like in 2017, when I was first starting to interact with the Flat Earth movement and monitor it, I saw that it was pretty limited to specific Facebook groups or certain YouTubers' followings, maybe a Telegram channel here and there if people were hip to that at the time. But I've noticed them bleed into each other a lot more. And so it used to be that the on-ramp to Flat Earth was probably a YouTube video. Like you were watching a video about astronomy or religion, or sometimes a more popular conspiracy theory. I know 9/11 truth is a huge on-ramp for a lot of flat earthers I've spoken to, and that makes sense. You know, it's something that people are naturally curious about, and there's a lot of videos about it. So for a while, those YouTube recommendations and maybe the odd Facebook post were what was introducing people to Flat Earth. These days, I see a lot of Flat Earth posting in other conspiracy channels. There's a QAnon influencer who's gone pretty hard on Flat Earth lately, and I'll be, you know, monitoring some other extremist channel, and it's like, damn, they're spamming Flat Earth too. So I think the on-ramps have gone from maybe being a little bit more like content creator driven to being I think a bit more of like a deliberate and a cynical network across conspiracy communities.
Yeah, and that is something you write about, and I've also heard in some of the podcasts you've done for this, you talk about quite a bit, which is kind of the cynicism between a lot of the folks who are spreading this. Do you have any kind of idea in your head about like how much of the shotgunning, you know, this kind of stuff out into the masses is a coordinated and cynical effort, and how much of it is driven by like real, like legitimate belief, like kind of, you know, evangelism that's honest?
I think a lot of the big Flat Earth influencers are earnest about their beliefs. If you go to a Flat Earth conference, for instance, those are, I mean, frankly, there are a lot of very evangelical voices, but those people are pretty serious about it. But I think there has been some almost riding the shock value of Flat Earth because it's so weird, right? That's what drew me in the first place. I'm not a Flat Earther and never will be, but I was interested enough to follow it for years and years. And I think the wait, what factor that accompanies it can really help smuggle in other conspiracy theories. And, you know, I got to this in my book, but as far as cynical actors go, the last Flat Earth conference I was at IRL in 2019, I was standing around and these two women approached me to give me a bracelet. I'm like, why are you giving me free things? Like, I don't trust this at all. And it had a little QAnon bangle hanging from it. I'm like, are you actually Flat Earthers? Are you just here to cross pollinate?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, we're not Flat Earthers, but we think Flat Earthers will be receptive to QAnon, which they believed in earnest. And I'm like, I hate that. And that's absolutely right. They
really
will
don't
be.
like hearing that.
Yeah. So there is definitely a degree of real cynicism. There are true believers, and I think there are shades of maybe believing, maybe questioning, but understanding that it's a potent theory and that it can be used to other means.
One of the things I really love about your book, and one of the things there are very few people in kind of this space, this, you know, kind of talking about modern day conspiracism, who do this well, is tie it back to the origins of this country. And you are really the only person other than myself and one fellow who's writing a book called Operation Mindfuck that I think a lot of folks will be interested in, that pointed out that the origin of kind of the first conspiracy theory in the United States really was the Illuminati, was belief in the Illuminati, because it starts right as the United States is, the late 1700s is when that conspiracy theory blows up. And you note, as you're kind of talking about the first flat earther, his last name starts with an R. I'm going to forget every name that I'm putting up here, but
It's all right.
But that's kind of like that conspiracy theory, the kind of these Illuminati conspiracy theories about this global elite trying to destroy Christianity and whatnot, that would have been happening when he was like a child to a young man, right? And then he's he's like this socialist kind of dude who lives in this weird utopian commune. and is selling like a kind of like quack cure that you could absolutely sell on Facebook today and make a bunch of money.
Totally.
Like you could have taken what's amazing about this dude is you could have picked him up and put him in 2022 and he would have been very successful. Like he's I'm interested in like how do you see kind of the evolution of conspiracism in the United States? Do you feel like we are where we've always been and it's just the speed at which things happen that's changed? Or do you see more material changes in the kind of conspiracies we believe?
You know, I'm tempted to say we are where we've always been. I think people are broadly the same and have been for probably thousands of years.
Yeah.
And, you know, you mentioned earlier that all of us have like some conspiracy theory we believe in. And that's not a weird tick. That's part of our very
Yeah.
human psychology. You know, when we don't have enough information, we'll go looking for an alternate answer. Or if we don't like the answer we've got, we'll go looking for an explanation that's comforting for us. And so that does lead us down certain conspiratorial paths. And I mean, also there are conspiracies that exist. So we've always been interested in that. And to take it back, yeah, to America's founding, there was definitely a vested interest in conspiracy belief. And, you know, one caveat to what I'm about to say, because you asked if we've always been this way or if this is new. There was kind of a shift shortly before the American Revolution where some scholars will argue that we went from thinking of conspiracy theories as maybe more nebulous to more concerted political plots.
Mhm.
And I think that ties in very nicely with the wave of revolutions that was going on, the American Revolution, then the French Revolution.
In 1848 and all these, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so these impulses that we've always had, these conspiracy impulses, became very useful for explaining what was going on in politics. And this notion of the Illuminati, which was briefly a real pro-Enlightenment group, it got disbanded and all that, but became this boogeyman for everyone. If anything happened, like a political revolution or just some political phenomena they didn't like, they could blame it on the Illuminati. So we have very early American figures talking about the Illuminati like they're Alex Jones, like it's so modern to read.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
One of my favorite documents that I cite in this book is this basically George Washington fanboy who is writing repeated letters to George Washington being like, I sent you this book about the Illuminati. Did you read it? Did you read it? And finally Washington's like, yeah, I got it, skimmed it. Yeah, seems plausible, man. I mean, I guess I'm kind of worried about that sort of thing. And I'm like, yes, that is, you know, that's when you email your uncle 50 times about Epstein stuff. It's very modern.
And it does kind of paint Washington as the first of these, because this is something you also discuss in the book, these like celebrity influencers who will like casually express interest in and thus spread it to a bunch of people. It's fascinating to think about George Washington as like, you know, if he'd had a Twitter, he might have been like, yeah, maybe read this, guys, and then, you know, cause a lot of problems. When it comes to that, with these like celebrities that are kind of casually, you know, they'll see a YouTube video or something and they'll share it and like, I'm just thinking, you know, it's just worth thinking about or something like that. There's a number of ways people frame it. What is the risk of celebrities kind of doing this, right? Whether they're kind of casual or they're really true believers, like to what extent do you see that as like a major vector for spread, or is it?
I think it's a minor vector for spread, definitely. I think that conspiracy networks online these days have enough of their own momentum that they don't need celebrities. I think the way that sites like YouTube, for instance, have for years run their algorithms that artificially promoted conspiracy theories, I think that is probably more potent in promoting conspiracy theories. But that said, when you do get like a Kyrie Irving talking about flat Earth, that promotes, you know, a wave of people looking into it directly from his account, and then all the articles going up being like, he said what? And I think it's very validating for the people who are already in a conspiracy theory, the people who are already in a movement, to say like, hey, you thought we were crazy, but we've got Tila Tequila on our team.
Mhm.
And it's, I mean, what bigger name do you need than that?
Yeah. What does that make you think about the responsibility we have as journalists, as academics, studying these things and writing about them and putting writing about them out to the world? How do you triage, I guess, between things that, okay, this is in the public interest, and as opposed to this is maybe giving something oxygen that does not need it?
Mhm. I think it's really tough, and it's not always binary. Sometimes things need sunlight, and
Mhm.
that comes with oxygen.
Yeah.
Um, Typically, what I am most interested in is coverage of this going to meaningfully contribute to public understanding of a phenomena? Is it going to help people deal with the reality of this phenomena in their lives because it is enough of a real world situation? Or is it something that I'm just looking at the fringes and kind of pointing and laughing at something sensational?
Yeah.
And it's a tough line to walk. One thing I'm very grateful for with this book is that in being able to examine this at length, I think I can get into the nuance and frankly the harm that comes with these theories. And I think, and certainly, I'm by my day job is as a journalist and writing at much shorter length. I think that's where we come into a lot more risk of just, turning out a quick hit on, oh, I don't know, QAnon drama,
Mhm.
when it's interesting, but I'm not sure it's always in the public interest. And it's hard to divine what's going to be relevant, five months down the road. But
Yeah.
it is something that I try and balance in my coverage.
Eh, what kind of a vector for spread do you think is, and this is not purely a product of journalists doing these kind of like, haha, look at this silly thing, but like often you'll have an article talking about like this individual person who says something kooky that's in the scene, or this individual, like, some argument or whatever, and it'll get coverage, and it'll start on Twitter or Facebook, people making fun of these folks, which then gets them trending, which then expands their reach and brings in people.
Mhm.
Do you actually see that as a real vector for these people to make money and to spread their beliefs? Or do you think that kind of stuff tends to just sort of be noise, but not necessarily harmful noise?
I think often it is a vector. I guess it depends on, the ratio of authentic engagement from their side versus being a dunk target. I think the Kent State gun girl is like one great example, because like I don't
Yeah.
know anyone who actually genuinely listens to her. I couldn't tell you a thing she said in her professional life, but every few months she'll log on to Twitter, say the dumbest thing you've ever heard, and just the natural impulse is to be like,
You want to
you want
dunk
to
on her.
you want to quote tweet because it's
Yeah.
just it's a layup. And
Yeah.
I think potentially, to her credit, she knows like it's like the kid in your third grade class who's like, I'm going to do something really stupid, but for 5 minutes I'm going to have so much attention. And I think
Yeah.
a certain segment of bad faith actors know that, and for some of them it has been enough to leverage that into a right-wing media or conspiracy media career.
It's interesting you bring her up, because obviously she's off kind of the topic of flat earth a little bit, but there is this I think the account Liberty Hangout that she
Oh
either runs or is
God.
a big part out, is one of the best examples of how catering your social media content to like just to get likes and engagement leads you into increasingly extreme directions. Because like a couple of years ago it was pretty bog standard libertarian pro-gun stuff, and then like 2 or 3 years later they're like unironically calling for a monarchy.
They're full monarchists now. It's incredible.
It's amazing.
It's so interesting to that effect. I mean, we talk about the algorithm pulling unsuspecting believers into flat earth because they're watching 9/11 truth videos, and here comes a flat earth video. I've met plenty of people like that, but I don't think we always account for how social media warps like existing influencers, right? There's that monetary incentive to be really extreme. I mean, moderation doesn't always sell online. Extreme feelings do. And I think, you can definitely make that case when it comes to conspiracy theories, because sometimes the reality is that, life is unpredictable and a little boring, and conspiracy theories sell the opposite, that there's some great dramatic plot and all you have to do is just tune in and you'll understand.
That's interesting. It makes me, and my thoughts on this are not entirely formed, but something from your book that this makes me think of. You talk about the first person whose life was ruined by the flat earth conspiracy theory. And it's this kind of dilettante kid. He's a rich kid. He stands to inherit a bunch of cash as long as he doesn't embarrass his family. And he gets really into flat earth, and he becomes involved in this like kind of PR contest with some people who believe that the earth is round, as it actually is. And it doesn't go well for him. And he starts harassing the guy who wins, right? And he starts sending this dude letters that, seriously, if you take these letters from the 1800s and you stick them into somebody's like DMs, like your D, like if it's like somebody DMing you today, it's like the same kind of stuff. And it's like the same kind of like weird death threat, obsessive stuff that you get when you write about these communities. And I was struck by how almost perfectly they've aged, if that makes sense. And I wonder the extent to which he was so very modern, because he was because people just have always kind of been the same in some ways, and how much he seems modern because he was a rich person who had the kind of free time that made him more modern, right? The fact that he had this like luxury time to spend obsessing over a weird thing as opposed to worrying about like feeding himself or like working in a mine. Like how much of it is that, like how much of the weirdness we have online is just kind of the luxury of our times?
That's a fascinating question. I didn't even think about that, because you're right. So for folks who I hope read the book, this was, he was a little prince, little heir, and he could have just coasted, inherited his money, but like so many people we know, decided to do the 1800s version of posting. And
Yes.
he became like a publisher of flat earth books, and he bought out all this flat earth stock, and he had this basically like debate me challenge in the newspaper, and got somebody to actually prove round earth to him. And he promptly dismissed the results, and spent the rest of his life sending this guy threats and going to jail for sending this guy threats. I think there is something to be said about that leisure. It's a lot of the bigger flat earthers I address in, the pre-internet times in this book did have some access to money. And it is interesting. Maybe that sort of warps our interactions with the social sphere in some way. It's not a normal concern to have. It's not a very intuitive response to what do you think is wrong with the world, which for many people might be, I don't have healthcare, or it's 1840 and my crops are rotting. So coming to flat earth as a solution is kind of counterintuitive. And it is interesting that it thrived, with rich folks back then, and now in the internet age, in more leisurely spheres, YouTube and things that don't have the urgency of, I don't know, political organizing. It's a really interesting question.
Because it's interesting when I think about a lot of the places I see conspiratism spreading, and particularly where I saw it spreading kind of before COVID supercharged everything. There's this chunk of folks who are like, some of them are independently wealthy, some of them are just like kind of upper middle class. They have a lot of free time. There's a lot of like coders and stuff. I definitely saw a decent amount of that. And then on a much sadder side, there's a lot of folks who are disabled, living on a fixed income. They have some amount of money coming in. They don't often can't leave the house, can't like work full time. And this is particularly during COVID. A lot of folks who were just kind of like trapped inside, they had health issues, they couldn't be around people, but they have the internet and all this time, and they are able to really fall down these rabbit holes as a result. And it does, it makes sense that like, in the 1840s or whatever, like, you know, you didn't have a lot of people in that position, but this kind of kid was, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. That is interesting. And, you know, it's interesting to kind of, you identify two groups there, people who
Mhm.
are, had a lot of time because they're wealthy and people who had
Yeah.
a lot of time because they physically couldn't
Yeah.
work. And I think that does describe two sets of people who, even, you know, in academic research about conspiracy belief,
Mhm.
who do tend to drift toward these things. And, you know, to the latter point, to people who have been disenfranchised in some way, conspiracy theories often act as a almost like an emotional immune response.
Yeah.
They are a means of grappling why things don't feel right, why the world doesn't seem to be working the way it should. And for people who, for, you know, a whole range of reasons, um, you know, all kinds of precarity. I know a lot of flat earthers who are very precariously employed. They're looking for reasons to feel as if they understand the world better, they understand its problems better, and then they can address those problems. So, yeah, I don't think it's any coincidence that this kind of theorizing applies to people who have time to dick around online and, you know, don't really have any financial consequences, and people who are desperately looking for answers in
Yeah.
a world that hasn't really provided for them.
Yeah. And that's always, and that's part of why it's so interesting that this starts with someone who's very much not, you know, in a precarious situation. But that's who it spreads through a lot. And there's data on this, you know, this is not just like
Mhm.
saying this based on our own observations. People who have suffered a trauma, people who are in a precarious situation are more vulnerable to conspiracy theories. That's something that there's a decent amount of evidence for. And it makes sense in part, I guess, just if you're thinking about like the kind of, I don't know, like old evolutionary parts of our brain where it's like, yeah, you're under threat all the time. You're looking for the source of that threat. And our brains are these
Mm.
incredible pattern recognizing machines. And maybe that's part of why people, you know, who are feeling threatened find. I think a lot about the fact that Bill Cooper, who is the proto Alex Jones and a huge, wrote this book called Behold the Pale Horse that is a
Oh,
foundational
yes.
document in like modern American conspiracism. And one of the chunks of the population that most fell in love with Bill Cooper is this like old white Vietnam veteran who lived on top of a mountain in Arizona. And he is hugely popular among the early gangster rap scene. There are albums by
Mm.
like major gangster rap artists based off of the titles of chapters in Bill Cooper's book, because it's these people who are living in a precarious situation. The government is after them, you know, like they
Mhm.
are being targeted by things you could call conspiracies, although and so yeah, they it's not even right to say that they like fall for it, because I think that using that kind of language almost minimizes the degree to which, well, yeah, I get why you would think of this as possible. It's the same reason why if you look at like the stuff that was going on in the United States in the 60s, the stuff the CIA was doing in the 50s and 60s, and then you think about the belief in the JFK assassination conspiracy theories, and it's like, yeah, I get why people were compelled by that. Of course, a lot of shady stuff was going on. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's funny because in investigating this book and in writing it, and frankly, just doing a lot of day to day reporting on conspiracy theories, you always run into that fact that there are conspiracies and that
Mhm.
there's very often a nugget of truth, either, you know, factually or even emotionally, in what people are believing. And I think that in many ways it makes it a bit harder to dismiss conspiracy belief. You you can't say that, you know, you're just a complete tinfoil hatter because, well, these people have seen legitimate reasons for doubt. And it's so
Yeah.
funny. I remember one recent flat earth conference I went to, you know, I always tell people, I'm like, hey, I'm a journalist, you know, I believe earth is round, but like, you know, let's hang out, let's talk, I'll listen to you. And somebody asked me, like, it was almost like seeing if I'm cool. They're like, so what theories do you believe in? I'm like, do you want to hear about US intervention in Latin America? Because it's real. It's
Yeah.
really happened.
Yeah.
And you know, when you know that your government is capable of that kind of thing, other conspiracy theories seem a bit more logical, and
Yeah.
especially when, the way the criminal justice system works in this country. I mean, it's not a whole bunch of people sitting in a dark room plotting, but it's a very enshrined system that is working against some people. So it's hard to be fully dismissive of certain predilections toward conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah. I want to get to some questions from the audience. One, I'm not sure if I should say people's names or not, but one person asked, how do flat earthers treat the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors, since both are extreme conspiracies?
It's funny. I love these questions that sound like completely reasonable in a modern frame, or
Yeah.
a reasonable frame. But then I have to tell you that most flat earthers don't actually believe in outer space. They believe that yeah, they believe that Earth is
Yeah.
a flat disk and there's an ice wall around it. And then most of them believe that there is a solid dome over the whole thing. So it's like a big snow globe. And for subscribers to that model, they don't believe there's anything outside the dome. They think that this is all of creation, contained in
Yeah.
here. And the best, so often when I'm talking to flat earthers, I'll ask, like, why do you think this is happening? And it yields interesting results. A lot of them are a bit anti-Semitic, but the best answer I got to this question once was I was hanging out with a guy at a conference, and he's like, well, see, they want us to believe in outer space so that we'll believe in aliens, so that when Christ returns to Earth, we'll think he's an alien and we'll kill him on sight. And I'm like, you've thought about this so much more than I have. So, I mean, that's in its way, it's a very fleshed out answer.
It is. It's fleshed out and also nonsensical, because, like, if you believe in the Bible, well, we didn't need an excuse to kill him last time. Like,
right.
People did that pretty quickly, right?
Yeah. No, we're not generally like a very peaceable kind of world right now. I don't think we need the alien excuse.
This does get at, someone else asked, what roles, if any, do biblical literalism and evangelical Christianity play in flat earth belief? And, like, as you kind of stated, and as you talk about in the book, a lot of people are offended by the idea that there might be, like, outer space or other planets and stuff, because then we're not, and God's creation, which is like us, isn't the center of everything.
Absolutely. And I think that was although flat earth theory doesn't necessarily need to be religious, you could go in as a secular person who believes in this disc. I think it's always been very foundational to it. Flat earth emerged in late 1830s, 1840s, and it was very biblically based. There is a lot of citation of weird cherry-picked readings of the Bible, where if they find a reference to a circle, they'll say that's evidence of flat earth in the Bible. But more than that, I think when flat earth was emerging, it was emerging alongside these fields of natural sciences and growing acceptance of evolutionary theories, things that put religion kind of in the back seats. And when you introduce a theory like flat earth that says not only are things like evolution incorrect, all of science is incorrect, all of science is a plot against you, I think that is tremendously helpful to people who want to reinstall religion as the foremost force in people's lives, because flat earth lets you chuck out all of science. And so these days, a lot of flat earthers you'll meet are very much biblical literalists, a weird kind. I grew up with a lot of creationists and all that, and their reading, which they thought was very literal, did not extend to a flat earth with a snow globe. But I think it's even within those very fundamentalist worlds, it's open to interpretation, and so it's that is a huge feeder into flat earth right now.
Yeah. You had another question here. Do you think the explosion of online conspiracies was an inevitability of the internet, social media in particular, going mainstream? It seems there's a major divide between those of us who grew up with the internet and those whose primary engagement comes through social media. And this is obviously, this is particularly noteworthy in places like Facebook, where folks tend to be older.
It's a good question. I don't know that it's inevitable because, I mean, most of us are not flat earthers. Most of us haven't gone down that rabbit hole. But I do think that a lot of social media maybe prioritizes some of our worst impulses. You know, I think I was discussing before, but that a lot of flat earthers get into the theory from YouTube. And that's because from like 2014 to 2019, that algorithm really artificially promoted conspiracy content.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, it makes sense. They know what you want to click on, and often what you want to click on is something sensational and weird. And that's flat earth. So we had this algorithmic boost to things like flat earth. And it didn't need to be that way. After they got so much criticism in 2019, YouTube changed the algorithm, and now it's a lot harder to find flat earth videos. But I think there are other ways that social media does play to our conspiratorial impulses, especially in a very politically charged conflict. Of course, thinking about Facebook being complicit in genocide in Myanmar. It's these don't need to be vehicles for really harmful misinformation, and yet because of, I think, I don't want to be a huge pessimist, but sometimes because of who we are, that is what they're used for. And they are they are faster for the spread of that information than anything else we have on hand.
Yeah. This actually leads a little bit into kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it is something I thought about a lot. One of the kind of characters, I shouldn't say character, he's a real person, but that is a centerpiece of your book, is this fellow who very famously built his own rocket. And the kind of, the primary media narrative was that he had done this to test some flat earth theories, and he dies as a result of the test going wrong. And he's a more complicated figure than that. There are people around who will say that, like, well, it was maybe more of a marketing thing, or maybe it started as a marketing thing, and then he came to believe it more. I remember I had not been following, because you knew this man personally. I had not been following his story much. I think I caught an article or two about him before the accident. The thing I remember when he died was kind of the glee that people responded to, yeah. And it was kind, because it was like February of 2020, right? That he died, which was right before COVID really started to hit. And now I see a line between kind of the way in which people made fun of his passing and stuff like the Herman Cain Awards. And it's very off-putting and very unsettling, but there's also a degree that I can't not understand, because I also have friends who might die as a result of the anti-vax kind of people spreading that stuff. So there's a degree to which one of them dies, and it's like, well, how sad should I really be? This was a person actively threatening the life of my loved ones in a way. And that's not really the case with this fellow, but I see the reaction to his death is very much tied into how much uglier our culture wars have gotten because of all of these things that we've been talking about, the way social media works, the way conspiracism spreads. And what was it kind of like engaging with that and engaging with the reaction to this death of a man that it seems like you liked, he was a nice guy, right?
Yeah, it was very uncomfortable because, social media, or the internet in general, allows us to interact with such distance. And it also prioritizes such strong emotions. And I think, frankly, such very team-based narratives. Nobody really feels like they're on team flat earth. And because things like flat earth provoke such derision in people, when Mike died in a rocket crash, which thank you for pointing out that it was not that launch was not to prove flat earth. That's been misstated a lot. But that he was, one of the most known faces of the flat earth movement, and he died in a launch that was tangential to it. People saw that as nothing to mourn. And it was very funny to find myself on the opposite side of, again, sort of on the opposite team. This was someone I liked. This was someone who, if you got to know him, he got into conspiracy theories because he found out about US genocide of Native Americans. And he's like, whoa, I didn't learn that in school. What else didn't I learn? You can see, or I can see at least so many people that I know in someone like that. And so I think this response, this derision to his death, it was almost like this, it was almost like this weird catharsis with people. It's like, oh yeah, that guy got what was coming to him, and they could laugh about it. And um, I think we've always, or I don't know how long the Darwin Awards have been going on, there's always been that very, I think when you examine it, very perverse form of humor that we've had. And it's become so much more explicit in the COVID era. It's suddenly you have team vax and team anti-vax, and I'm very team vax. I have people who would be tremendously harmed if they caught COVID from an anti-vaxxer, but I've seen it play out very explicitly in the flat earth world. A lot of prominent flat earthers, I can think of two very prominent ones, have died from COVID, and they were anti-vaxxers, and one was a huge highlight on Herman Cain Award on that subreddit. And this wasn't even someone I liked to the extent that I was close with Mike, but even though we had our disagreements, it felt just wildly cruel. And again, I think the internet can just allow us to teleport into somebody's life and pick apart the talking points of it and make our own narrative about it. And I just think that's really dehumanizing, even if you don't like the guy, even if you don't agree with the guy. To have that reaction, I think is a little fucking gross.
Yeah. And it's particularly gross with Mike, because I think at any time if there had been a plague and people who denied and refused to do the thing that would stop from spreading it, and then they died, there's going to be people who celebrate that, as gross as it is. I think Mike 10, 15 years ago would have been a hero to a lot of the people who were like laughing at his passing. He would have still believed probably some kooky things, but I think it would have been a lot easier, because this was all so much less polarized, for people to be like, well, whatever he believes, he's like making rockets, and that's really neat. And it's kind of like, I think about Grizzly Man a lot, right? And that dude was actually quite a bit less pleasant than Mike was in a lot of ways, but he gets this movie about him that is in a lot of ways very sympathetic and very much like, well, he's kind of this folk figure. And there's a thing that's special that we kind of celebrate about, like, the weirdness of these people who do these things, even if it leads to their end. And it certainly was not a thing where, I guess there were people when Timothy Treadwell died who celebrated it, but it was not to the, like, I can think of if Mike had gone the same way when I was 19 or 20, he probably would have been someone that me and a lot of people that I hung out with would have been like obsessed with, just because there's this kind of Don Quixote air to him. And it is, I think we've lost something kind of precious, that the reaction was so different in such a dark way.
I think the completely alternate way that this could have just as easily have been viewed is not as him doing this launch to prove flat earth, which again wasn't exactly it was a step on his path to trying to prove flat earth. But in doing all these interviews with people who knew and loved him, the resounding response I got was there was nothing you could have done to talk this guy out of it, because he was this force of will. He wanted to push these extremes, and whether that was for conspiracy theory or just because that's who he was going to do it. There was no talking him out of it. And I think it would have been just as easy to apply that framework to him, and we just didn't get it. We got the flat earth story, even though it wasn't exactly accurate, and it became discussion of the Darwin Awards instead of, I mean, yes, his death was conspiracy driven and tragic, and it should be something we learn from, but something more human.
Yeah. This is a question from the audience, and it's one that I think anyone who does this kind of research gets. I've never felt, I don't really feel like I have good answers to it. So I'm going to ask it to you because I hate getting this question. How can social media be regulated or otherwise improved to reduce the conspiracy nonsense?
Woof. Yeah, that's a really good one. No matter what I say, I'm gonna get
It
like
is a good
punched
question.
5 different
Yeah,
ways by people I like and agree with at various times. It's really tough. I am in some ways slightly more libertarian, I think, about Facebook regulation, I think, than most people on the left might be. And the reason for that is that, well, I think there is often an immediate benefit from banning certain harmful content. And I think we'd all agree about that to a certain extent. There's not a soul who's going to argue to leave, say, child exploitation material online. We all believe that these platforms can remove content. The issue you run into is that a platform like Facebook just stringently believes in its right to, or its ability even to stay neutral. So when a Facebook takes down, I cover the far right a lot. When they take down a Proud Boys channel, they take down Crime Think or It's Going Down, which are two longstanding leftist and anarchist publications, which I think are tremendous sources of information for a lot of people who aren't even members of that movement. I find them valuable resources. So when you enable platforms like that, which are, inherently capitalistic, they are not out to really better the world, but are there to improve their image and to maintain a profit. I don't think they always have the best interest in mind. So that's sort of my cautionary tale about removing this kind of content. Again, I think there are often immediate benefits to it. So I can't fully say you shouldn't pull this content at all. It's really thorny. You don't want to be the person responsible for leaving bad content up. I think bans can even work, frankly, if I'm going to be completely honest about it. So many platforms banned Alex Jones, and he's like, oh, this is going to make me the martyr that I always knew I was going to be. I'm going to come back bigger and better. You don't hear about him any times these days, except when he's getting sued, I think.
When he's getting sued, or every now and then he'll say something that people take the bait on,
Right. Marjorie Taylor Greene went on a show the other day, and it's like, wow. I mean, that's not even like going on 2015 InfoWars. That's somewhat sadder.
I honestly, it made me feel a little bit better about her because she's someone who worries me. It's like, oh well, if maybe she's in a worse place than I thought.
That's grim. Just apolitically, that's a really grim place to be. So it is a huge it's a huge risk reward trade-off, and I wish I had the right answer. I do think it can be effective. I do think it can be misappropriated. I guess the maybe it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but the best thing I have is that I mentioned earlier that these social media algorithms can artificially promote certain content, like on YouTube, and they changed the algorithm, and it actually did do a lot of good. So when these platforms are already actively working against common sense, that they should just fix that. And that's about as close to an answer as I have.
That's where I tend to be, where there's a lot of dangers in talking about kicking people off. It's not really dangerous to say like, well, maybe we could make them accountable one way or the other, penalize them for the things their algorithm does, because then you don't have to be deplatforming people, but you don't have to be amplifying them. And I think that's maybe a better way to think about it. How do you see this is another question from the audience. How do you see the expansion of conspiracy theorists affecting our politics going forward?
Oh, very badly. It's tough because I've spent a lot of this evening talking about the role of like social media and artificially amplifying conspiracy theories. But at a certain point now, like I think we've crossed the Rubicon where conspiracy theories are so much a part of the standard Republican platform that it's going to be very hard to uncouple that from, just day-to-day politics for God knows how long. I think, in addition to immediate risks of that, say like, I don't know, terrible anti-trans bills
Yeah.
circulating because of deliberate misinformation about transgender children. I think there's even a more systemic risk to it. I think there's this wholesale erosion of trust and of this shared reality that we should, in a healthy society, be maintaining together. And I think when we start losing that, it's easier for people to push more fringe ideas. It's easier to get past bills that let them decertify certain electors that they don't like, that lets them rein in voting rights in certain predominantly Black neighborhoods. So yeah, I think that these conspiracy-driven narratives are, in the immediate sense, helping push certain legislation, and in the longer term, opening the field to all kinds of distrust.
Yeah. Now, I'll ask this. Are you going to have the book translated into different languages? Is that something you and your publisher have on the?
I don't actually know. I would love that. I don't know how that goes. I presume it would help if I sold like 1 million copies. So if you'd like to buy at least 10 and maybe sell them in like a pyramid scheme, that kind of thing.
I'm going to tell them buy 1 million. Somebody listening here has the cash. Buy 1 million copies and go off the end. Yeah.
Yeah, and that should get us definitely some translation rights.
Yeah. I want to talk, because we only have a little bit of time here. One of the most fascinating things that I was not legitimately, probably surprised is the wrong word, but I did not know and was most interested to learn, was this new tactic, which now I am blanking on the name of, where they will confront like random, like waiters.
Flat smacking.
That's it. Right. And I'll just summarize the basic thing. They will confront people who are like working service industry jobs or stuff. So people who, as you point out, have to kind of be polite to them because it's like what they're getting paid to do and stuff. And we'll start just kind of spouting, parts of this conspiracy theory, trying to engage them. Like, do you know this? Do you know how fast the world spins? Like, basically trying to like get them trapped into a conversation via these talking points, and they film it. And it's interesting to me because it sounds very similar to like what Baked Alaska's been doing for a while. His is much uglier. Well, he'll like walk into a mini mart and he'll start like saying racial slurs or yelling at people for wearing masks or whatever. But there's also some DNA of like the debate me bro community, these folks who would always try to be like, well, let's have a debate about this. Let's have a debate about that. And I'm wondering, how do you see this? What do you think it is more of? Is it more kind of descended from one or the other?
I think it's probably, if it's like the ugly child of anything, it's probably of people making like stunt videos, oh, I'm gonna like, there's this genre of like, I'm gonna jump over a police officer who's sitting on a bench and just see what happens, which is like, scientifically a little interesting. I'm like, okay, I'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'll watch this.
And the other strain is, I think, just customer entitlement. People believing that anyone in their radius, especially people in the service industry, need to listen to them and treat them like little chieftains. And I think there was a really good synthesis of this in the early COVID days by a flat earther. This was actually her most viral video, not a flat earth one, where she tried going into a supermarket in California with no mask and saying, you've got to let me in, you're violating my HIPAA rights. It was one of the pioneers of that slogan.
Yeah. Trailblazer.
Yeah, an innovator in her way. And I don't think it fully clicks that the reason people were not imminently cursing her out were because they were underpaid service workers afraid for their safety.
Yeah.
And so you have this weird nexus of people doing things for attention because they know that behaving outlandishly is going to get that attention for them, and believing that they should be listened to and kind of doted on in public. And I think the latter is actually a pretty common American sentiment. So I'm not wholly surprised to see this tactic become pretty popular on YouTube.
And I'll say this will probably be our last question looking at the time. Do you think there is any point in debating these people?
Often no. I, in the book, speak to a couple ex-flat earthers who did deconvert, but they said it wasn't so much debate that helped them. And I think I understand that. I think often debates where there's a winner and a loser don't change minds. They just cause people to double down.
Yeah.
But what helps them was more conversation-based, a compassionate frame, from people who weren't trying to humiliate them or visibly prove them wrong. Of course, I think someone changing their mind requires, conscious effort on that person's part. They need to be willing to change their minds. But I think the conversations that were most persuasive were the ones where someone acknowledged them as a person. And so I don't debate flat earthers because on one hand, I'm a journalist reporting on them and I almost don't want to meddle, but I also don't, in most cases, have a personal connection with them. And so I think sometimes, why would you listen to me? But if I had a relative who was getting into flat earth, I like to think that, we could sit down as someone that they trust, and we could have a discussion about why this isn't right and why maybe the people who are pushing this do not have your interests at heart. And if anything helps, it seems to be that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about an hour for us. Is there anything else, Kenny, you wanted to say or get to in this?
I think those were great questions. It was really interesting sort of interrogating how money worked in the system, because it's not something I've given much thought, and I kind of want to reread the graphs that I wrote about that. But thanks for a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for writing the book. It's really, really, really well written and very fascinating. I'm excited for more people to get it in their hands.
Thank you, Robert. And thanks, Kelly, for being with us tonight. In the chat, I am putting a link to the book again, Off the Edge. That's what it looks like right there. And also, thanks, Robert. This is Robert's upcoming book. And just so you know, Robert is going to be doing an event at our store on May 3rd. So
fingers crossed.
That. Yes. Yeah, I'm sure it'll happen.
Yeah. I
think the odds are good. Also in the chat right now, I just posted a link to our YouTube channel. Our videos, our events are recorded. So this event will be popping up on our YouTube channel probably sometime tomorrow. If you have friends that missed it or wanted to share it with people, feel free to click over there and can share the event when it goes up tomorrow, and check out all of our other past events. Lots of great stuff on that channel. Once again, Kelly, Robert, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And everyone at home, thank you for tuning in, and have a great night.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.